Have you ever gone hiking someplace like Colorado, and maybe you've come from Texas or Oklahoma and you're down around 1,000 feet or lower, and all of a sudden you're up at 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10,000 feet? Why stop there? Have you ever gone up to a 14er? Have you ever felt dizzy or nauseous, or you've gotten really sick? Well, you've got altitude sickness, or you were on the verge of it. And I want to tell you about a couple stories and how you can avoid altitude sickness. You may not be able to avoid altitude sickness, but you can do a lot to limit your chances of getting it or how serious that altitude sickness is. I'm going to give you some advice at the end, but let me tell you about a few things that have happened with my dad, myself, and actually my daughter. Well, the first thing that happened around 20 years ago is I went hiking with some friends from work and my dad up to New Mexico, northern New Mexico. We were up north of Red River and we were hiking up to the Lapeer Peak Wilderness area, and we started at Heart Lake, I believe it was. No, it wasn't Heart Lake. We started at Cabresto Lake and we wanted to hike up to Heart Lake to camp up there. And Heart Lake is around 11,500 feet. Now my dad was the oldest of all of us. He was used to being at lower altitudes, and he's always been in the outdoors, but it really doesn't matter so much as when you go to a higher altitude, you've got to be ready. You've got to acclimatize yourself, hopefully. Well, there was about 5 or 6 of us in this group, and we got up to Cabresto Lake and we started hiking, and immediately my dad wasn't feeling very good. Well, my dad's a pretty tough guy and he's no longer with us, and he was born around World War II time frame in the 40s. And even though he was feeling sick a little bit or nauseous, he said, all right, let's go, no big deal, I'll get over it. So we go and start hiking, and we get past Cabresto Lake and we start heading up in the mountains. Well, I don't remember exactly, but we may have been a mile or 2 up the trail, and we were probably at least at 10.5. I think we're getting close to 11 because Cabresto's around 10.5. Well, by this time we're up there a mile or so past the lake, and it's getting so bad that my dad's either throwing up or about to throw up. So as a group, we decided to go back down to Cabresto Lake and camp there, and then we can day hike. So we head back down. We were up there for 3 days, but it took almost a full 3 days before my dad recovered. None of us were thinking it was altitude sickness, but it absolutely was. He was nauseous, he was sick, he was throwing up, he was getting dizzy. I mean, everything you can think of that is an altitude sickness symptom. Well, let's just say that trip was no fun for my dad. I think he had some fun coming up and maybe on the way down, and he did enjoy some views of the lake and hanging out around the campsite. But he didn't get to go hiking, but he did get out to northern New Mexico, and he loves the mountains and the pine trees and fir trees. My dad grew up in Oregon and Washington and spent a little bit of time in California, and he just loves the outdoors, but he should have been ready, but none of us were thinking about it. None of us gave him advice. And I'm going to give you some advice in just a minute, but let me tell you about 2 other stories. The other one was when I was up near Bailey, Colorado, and I was heading up towards Mount Evans, but I wasn't on Mount Evans, but I got up to around 12,000 feet. I've already told this story before, but I'm just going to touch on it here for those who haven't seen the video. But I go up there by myself. I didn't have a satellite communicator, and I got up there. The storms started kicking up. I was all alone up there. It was gorgeous. But I started to get really nauseous, and I had to get off that mountain because the storms were coming in. And I was so nauseous at that point, I could go no more than about 50 feet and I had to stop. And the storm was coming in and I was concerned it was going to start producing some lightning. But I had to pace myself and go slow or I was going to collapse. It was a really bad situation. Now I'm here today and I'm alive, so I got off the mountain. But that's another example of another time when I got altitude sickness. It wasn't as severe as my dad's, but it was the onset of the altitude sickness. Now, once I knew I was out of harm's way and I was down around the tree line, I was able to stop, drink some water, and rest for a while, and then I wasn't bothered by the altitude sickness so much. I didn't feel like I was going to throw up, and I was able to walk down comfortably and get to my truck, and I was happy to see my truck because that was a long hike. But I've experienced the onsets of altitude sickness myself. Now, my daughter, she probably experienced it less in ways because she was younger and in better shape. She was training with the search and rescue team in Gunnison, Colorado, and they covered the whole Gunnison Valley area. And they start up around what is it, 10,000 feet or so is where Gunnison is, and then Crested Butte and all that. And they cover that whole area. And they train and have to be rescued from anything, from cars rolling over up on Monarch Pass to hunters getting lost or people on ATVs turning over. So they have to be ready all the time, and they have to move quickly. And then they're also climbing up these mountains higher than 10,000 feet. That's where they start, and they're up around 11, 12,000 feet. Well, there were several times she had to head back down to the base camp with somebody else, because they would always keep somebody with you. You never go out by yourself, and even if you're going back because of some injury or altitude sickness, there's always two people. And there were several times that she had to stop being part of that rescue operation because of the onsets of altitude sickness. And even though she didn't get full altitude sickness, she did have to stop the training. Now let me tell you what you can do to keep from getting altitude sickness or limit its effect on you. The first thing you can do with altitude sickness or to help yourself is to drink a lot of water. I'm not talking about drinking a lot of water on the day you go out. I'm talking about drinking a lot of water for a week ahead of time, at least 3 days ahead of time. Start hydrating. Another thing you should do is, one, if you're overweight, try to lose weight, get in shape. If you're going to go hiking as an example, then start hiking ahead of time. I don't care if you're from Texas or Oklahoma or someplace down where it's a low elevation. Start getting in shape for your activity before you head up, and I would say 2-3 months ahead of time. So besides the water, besides getting in shape ahead of time, number 2 is give yourself some time when you come up to places like Colorado. I highly recommend you acclimate for a little bit. So say you're coming up here to Gunnison, for example, and you're going to go up to Crested Butte. Well, I live down near Denver and Colorado Springs, actually about halfway in between. And so one thing you could do is you could come up to Colorado Springs, and it's around 5,500, 6,000 feet, I think it is. Come up, stay the night, do some walking around town, have some lunch, dinner, whatever it is. Spend one day around Colorado Springs at around 6,000 feet. Then maybe head over to Gunnison and spend a night in Gunnison, and maybe you're at a hotel there. Again, hike around, and at that point you'll be at 10,000 feet, but not a real rugged hike. But get acclimated. And I want to give you another example of something, and it's when my sister came up here to Colorado to visit and to go hiking with me. She was really wiped out because she was hiking around 7,000 feet up to about 8,000 or 9,000 feet, but it took her about 3 days. On her 4th day, she was starting to get used to the altitude. So again, if you're going up to Crested Butte or Gunnison, get up here somewhere for at least 2 days if you can. Because a lot of people come up here and they'll say, I'm going to take a long weekend, and they come up here for 3 nights. And they get right to hiking or whatever their activity is. Do yourself a favor and add a couple more days and enjoy Colorado. Add 3 more days. Make it a 6-night trip. Acclimate yourself, because you're going to have a lot more fun up here if you do that. I'm going to read some things to you real quick because I don't feel like memorizing it, but it's how to adjust to altitude. Drink lots of water. Reduce your exercise ahead of time. That actually doesn't make sense to me. Maybe you want to be less tired and be ready. So I would say increase your exercise ahead of time 2-3 months in advance, but maybe right before you go, be more relaxed and not so tired. Get a lot of sleep. Limit alcohol intake. Increase potassium levels. Protect yourself from the sun. Okay, well, that really doesn't help with altitude sickness. Come on. Consume more calories. And then the other thing I didn't mention earlier was consider taking a drug. Not a bad drug, but I'm going to try to say this. It's like acetazolamide. I'm going to put that up on the screen because I probably just destroyed how you pronounce it. All right, those are some things about limiting altitude sickness. And yes, taking that drug or drugs like it can help. I've never done it, but if I were prone to altitude sickness, I would. Now let me read the symptoms of altitude sickness in case I've gotten anything wrong or forgotten anything. Inability to exercise, fatigue, loss of appetite or low oxygen in the body, sleepiness or sleeping difficulty, nausea, vomiting, rapid breathing or shortness of breath, fast heart rate, headache, insufficient urine production, or respiratory distress syndrome. Now let me just add, when you're camping up around 11,000, 12,000 feet, you probably won't sleep very good, and I never do. I have these light headaches. And it's horrible sleeping for me up at that elevation. 10,000 feet, I'm fine. You get up to about 11, 12, I'm not so good. All right, I just wanted to give you some examples of what's happened to some of us here in Colorado, and I wanted to give you some ideas of how to reduce altitude sickness. And I hope this has helped you to get out here to places like Colorado and enjoy your trip. Thanks for joining me today, and get out there in the outdoors and be safe.